Dr. Shauheen Etminan, welcome aboard.
Gordon, thanks for having me today. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Now, what I typically do in my new podcast era this year is I ask ChatGPT for a biography of my clients. But in your case, particularly, like a lot of the cool stuff you've been doing is after their 2021 cutoff.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to attempt a biography of you, Shaheen, and how it works is I'm going to tell everyone what I know about you, and then you correct me and add parts, and that's how we introduce you on the show.
Yeah, I
So
watched
I'll begin.
your episode with Mark as well, so that would be.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, ChatGPT did him pretty good. Sometimes it gets people, yeah, sometimes it gets people quite wrong, which is funny, actually. Then people can say, no, I was not born in Japan. I was born in Birmingham. Like, it's quite good. Yeah. All right. Born in Iran and raised in Canada, Dr. Shauheen Etminan is a chemical engineer, business owner, investor, ethnopharmacological researcher, and co-originator of a line of nootropics based on the ancient medicines of pre-Zoroastrian and Zoroastrian Iran, including what is, I believe, and I'm sure you do as well, the best candidate so far for the legendary and elusive substance of the gods, known as most famously Soma, but Haoma in how we're going to be having that discussion today. So, how is
I
that?
think it was brief and to the point. I feel that I have gone through several lives, and the most recent version of me, definitely.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, now that we've introduced you and laid out where our topic is, you get the traditional first question, which is Shaheen, were you a weird kid?
Um, In some senses, yes, I was a weird kid. Not that weird, but to some level, I had my own things happening. I kind of say like I had like my childhood mysticism somehow. I had this moments that I had to, I would say like at that point, it was either meditation or mostly prayers, that for me, with the context that I was experiencing within the family, was allowing me to kind of build my self-confidence and for kind of encountering what's happening in the outside world. And I guess to me, whenever I look back, that's the most weird part of my childhood.
All right. So, were you praying differently to the family? Were you praying to like where was it behaviorally different, or were the experiences with retrospect you think, okay, that was probably something?
Yeah. So we never. So I'm coming from a family that my dad was anti-religion. So from very childhood, he was trying to show that the construct of the religions are very dogmatic and kind of like even over pushing that. So like even being a little bit conservative on my childhood side, and from my mom always trying to keep it more on a milder version. But I think part of it to Iranians always come from this notion that Iranians are practicing as Muslims, but they are not really Muslims. They are Zoroastrian Muslims, or they are a little bit of a different versions of Muslims, I would say. And so there's traditions versus religions, and even prayers are the same. So we never really prayed, let's say within the family or as a group. But the weirdness was around the fact that I was taking, mostly at night, I was taking this time by myself, closing, like locking the door, going to the room, and then like having this kind of like moments of prayer. I think for that age, I'm talking about when I was 8 actually. And I was looking into, let's say, holy book at that point. It was both. It was Quran, for me, and also, I think it was also a Hafiz book at that point, and was trying to get something mystical out of that. And it's very funny because for me, just like opening this, just setting an intention, opening it up, and there was these messages that some pages was like the text was bolder, and there's some pages that they were not. So these are nothing to do with my parents, but it was mostly around, I think
Sure.
for me it was Yeah, it was kind of like something within that I was trying to build upon. And from a childhood experience, it was like for me to feel more confident the next day when I was going to school that like everything is going to open up. I was being held and protected. And I think I had that. And there's the funniest thing, I was actually sharing this with another friend yesterday, was that like I remember there was a day that like we had friends over and their kids were playing, and within the play I left again, closed the door, and like while all the kids are playing, and then like had my little ritual, and then came back and then just like resumed playing with them. So I would say this was probably, beside being curious, I also had a lab. I was like a chemistry lab in my closet, so I think that was mostly because my mom was a science teacher and I was doing like all kinds of experimentation. So these are the two highlights of being a weird kid.
I like that because I can construct a narrative after the fact that sums up part of the journey we're about to go on because you're hearing first. So there's the maternal influenced material exploration side, but that exploration drive is still there on the inner level, which is going to be the principal part of the discussion today about where it is. The adventures I'm having now are focused quite a bit on the interior, still built on the exterior, still built on a molecular understanding, right? So it's almost like there's a left hand, right hand component to how it is young Shauheen was making sense of the world that we can draw a line to now.
Absolutely. Like reflecting back, these are, as I said, it's like whatever at that age is just having a inner journey is just so big, for example, for a kid. And I don't think that my family were mystical. I would say like Iranians are mystical in some level, all of them, but it's kind of in a lower layer. It's not the surface. But it's still, yeah, looking to like the path that I've gone in the past 41 years, that's pretty much, aligned with those experiences at the very young age.
Very cool. And when did you emigrate to Canada? How old?
I was 21. It's about like 20 years ago. But I have stayed
Wow.
very
Okay.
connected to Iran. So I kind of like, I would say I'm part of a generation of diaspora, of Iranian diaspora that are probably a very rare group because as my upbringing was in Iran. I went to school, I had like Persian literature, I went to learn about, let's say, all these, let's say, mystical paths and everything. And then after that, when I finished my undergrad, I moved to Canada to do my grad school. And since then, I have been always, connected to the social progression and what's happening in Iran, including all whatever, the hardships and traumas, of the past 20 years and before that. But I would leave that for the next question.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's interesting to me. I thought I was a little bit younger. I have a friend of mine I grew up with who emigrated from Greece to Australia when he was about 6 or 7, and he became like he speaks and reads ancient Greek now. Like it was always very alive for him. His background growing up amongst principally white Anglo Australians, and I wasn't sure if what your journey was like there because you actually find that in diaspora communities that the there is a pull to that kind of not just which we just described, like a contemporary Iranian identity. But the work you're doing is years ago in Iran, not not so much like
Exactly. Not
social
many
movements and
Iranians
things
even
that are
know
happening.
about this. It's interesting. I guess coming from these a little bit like more ancient civilizations, the amount of knowledge is so much that the peoples of like contemporary people are not able to really dig into many of, let's say the depth of many of them because of the amount of material, I think, let's say, in a Westerner's eye, let's say when they read Rumi or when they read Hafez, it's the gist of it. It's very just, they just
Mm.
integrate that into their lives. But when you're like reading them in Farsi, you have to go through all the metaphors and unlock. And like, it's nice, it's beautiful, but at the same time, like let's say for a regular temporary person that doesn't really have the capability to translate all these metaphors, is kind of like a barrier to understand that, versus the translation to another language is making it much easier to understand.
Yeah, I like that. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. So, when did you start getting into whirling, and was that part of this like diaspora process of reconnection, or did
No, 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 no. It was so whirling for me has been. Thanks for asking that question. Whirling for me has been always very, yeah, kind of like kept it very like to me, versus just putting it out. And the reason for that is because I would say this is really an ancient, meditation in motion versus the way that they have put it out, let's say, even from the Mevlevi order, that they go in a very codified approach to whirling versus, let's say they call it in Iran, they call it whirling dance, which they call it dance. It's a dance, like they just put something nice and then it has this external exposure. So to me, there's no external exposure about this. Everything is inside. There is this perimeter of, like the circle around you, that whenever you think that like there is an eye from outside, you're probably doing it for a wrong reason, but whenever you are within and in the boundary, then you are actually within yourself. But actually my journey with whirling started in, I was exposed through two of my ex-girlfriends to basically Sufi tradition. It was very interesting. There were different lineages as well. And it was like the first one, it came as an invitation. I always had this mystical calling, but I didn't really pursue. The second one, she was also a Sufi. And with that, I started basically getting into zikr, and zikr is exactly like mantras and practices of meditation. And then it was back in 2017. It's not many years ago. It's about 6 years ago that I traveled to Konya, which is basically the shrine of Mevlana. And there I was very curious. I had no intention to get into whirling. I probably had just turned once before in Berkeley with the dervish community in Berkeley, which is also a big community. And when I was in Konya, this is during that December 10th to December 17th, which is the Whirling Dervish Festival. That's like all the dervishes from all the lineages come to Konya. And then the December 17th is called the night of wedding, or they call it the Ors, or the Arus, which in Farsi means the bride. That's the night that they are saying that the soul of the Mevlana actually just like went into the wedding with the god. And there is this whole city just meditating and whirling. And I was there in 2017, and I actually through somebody I was initiated, and I started turning, and I was just right there. I never practiced, and I never thought that I have to just put my feet like that or the other. And I felt that, okay, this is a practice that I was called into, and it's very natural. My body goes very naturally into this trance state, and it's equilibrium. And since then, I have been practicing very regularly. I'm actually also looking into it as just that scientific side of me. I have been working on basically unlocking the neurophysiology of whirling as well. So that means that I have collected a lot of biomarker data, which is brainwave, heart rate, on whirling, that I'm actually soon is gonna be published in a paper, as well as a website that I'm looking into, basically the science of whirling as a meditation.
Wow. So how long is a whirling session on average then?
So whirling session is, as a practice, you can turn and turn, for how long you're comfortable with. I would say the average, there was a Rumi festival in Seattle back in 2000, I think it was 19 or 18 that I participated, and it was like a 24-hour whirling. But it was not like 24-hour everybody. It was 24-hour for holding the space. So I think probably there I had turned for, let's say 25 minutes to about 45 minutes, just non-stop. And, but it's not something that you really feel tired of. You just have to keep that state of mind, and you can turn and turn. But usually when I practice, it's something between, let's say, 15 minutes to about, like less than 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. And so, because actually one of the first guests I ever had on the show before it was really a podcast was another psychonaut. And we were talking about the human propensity to alter states of consciousness. And his example was watching his two kids growing up, and how kids will just spin around until they fall down and realize that there's an alteration going on there. In your case, in the case of whirling is more than that, right? But there's a biological drive that is kind of interesting there, that like kids will naturally find their way into an alteration that points inward, right? The experience and the joy of themselves, which I think in your journey, as I look at it from the outside, it's interesting to me, given where the ancestral Magi project has ended up, that you found. And did you find whirling prior to your first psychedelic experience? Like, does it go in that sequence, or did you do
No,
psychedelics then whirling and go, actually
before
these
mine.
are.
Yeah, I would say yeah, this is 2016, 7. I think it was, they all came around the same time. I was living in San Francisco at the same time. My first ayahuasca experience was in California. It was a California version of it. And so it was kind of around the same time. But I guess that calling that year for me, specifically, I remember that was the year that I took basically a leap of faith to leave the corporate job, and just like getting to become a full-time entrepreneur, as I have been the past 6 years. And I guess that was a lot of soul searching, and that they came around the same time for me. But in terms of the effect, I would say, yeah, I have done psychedelics. I've tried. I've been mushrooms, psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, if it's counted also as a psychedelic, and also a lot of beta carbolines. That's what we are working on. And there are psychedelics that I haven't tried, but I would say I have had this feeling that like my consciousness is being like kind of like dissociated. Like these are the biggest, like the altered states that you really feel that this is an altered state of consciousness. Because when you think, very, let's say, on a very high flush of thought, and you're processing, when you see that like the images are moving, they are also like altered state. But I think in the alteredness, then there are degrees and there are different channels that you tap into. With whirling is the same. With whirling, when you're turning, with the open eye, like the images that you see, then all of a sudden, specifically when you just go and when you chant and when you go faster, you're like it's just the whole continuum that it comes toward you. It's just one space. It's a one space that you're in, and but yeah, I would say I can't really say that this was more powerful than the other one. I have been approaching all of them in a very careful, and step by step way, I would say.
Gotcha. So the kid who was obviously interested in mystical experiences and had some kind of mystical frame also became a chemical engineer and then went and sat with ayahuasca. How do you frame that experience? Did you did you look at it principally from the point of view of, which is a level I don't have much time for, is that like molecular activity level? Did you look at it more like, okay,
Yeah.
I can describe it this way, but it's like it's part of a bigger cosmovision. This is telling me something about consciousness in the universe. So what was it like after your first psychedelic experience, when you have this mystic interest, but you also.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say science has always been a tool for me, to understand things better, just as a tool, let's say. And specifically, like getting into chemical engineering from the beginning, it was, I think, at being born and raised in Iran, at some level, there are some intricacies about like being raised in Iran, going to an undergrad in Iran, is that you don't have much chance to really choose. It's a little bit like, probably might be weird from an outsider, but there's this big exam that everybody just participate and then like is pick and choose, But when I came to Canada specifically, I am more a person of I have to observe. Like everything that I've done, if you should look into some of my papers, there have been always just this measurements in a medium of like the physical medium. They were all experimental. So experimentation has always been part of me, and I take a lot of risk into experimentation. Specifically, let's say when you do a PhD thesis with experimentation, like everybody know that this may take very long time, but I would say when I started chemical engineering, I had no vision where I was going. In my second year of my PhD, I knew that I have nothing to do with that industry, which at that point was like the energy industry. and and but at the same time, I was receiving a lot of scholarships, from the university. I was one of the best students, and that was the point that I started to do a lot of social entrepreneurship. I started my entrepreneurship journey as a social entrepreneur, but at the same time, I kept myself within the realm of fundamental physics. So it was a chemical engineering, but if you look into my works, they're mostly physics. And there are physics and transport phenomenon physics, which is basically looking into different mediums in the nature and then the flow that happens through the potential difference. And with that, I guess that gave me this this perspective about everything, in the nature, that everything is a phenomenon, that you can find the analogous, processes in elsewhere, and then understand it better. Like in physics, everything is tangible, but then when you go beyond physics, like say the next is energy. The energy is not tangible. You may feel that, say, the temperature, but I guess now that I'm going through the understanding of world from the lens of, like, say, Shauheen today, what is really fascinating for me is the medium of thoughts and consciousness, and then the flow that you goes through one way and to the other. And that flow is actually the knowledge that we receive through intuition. And then how you can set this kind of medium up in a way that you are exposed to a potential difference of knowledge for that to flow toward you is what that language of science is helping me to unlock the realm of the mystic realm better.
It's very well explained. I'm sure I'm not the first person who's asked you that, or you've had to sit with like, it's almost like, how do I sequence my thinking? It's like I begin with consciousness and intuitive inspiration, and it ends like, and then the next part is the scientific component rather than scientific component. Does that make sense? Like it's you live in a very different reality depending on how you sequence those capacities.
Yeah, I think it's, I guess from one point of view, that when you have the tool of science, basically, it always keep you cautious about using the language that is not the right language. And for something that we don't know, and it's like exactly like that elephant that you touch different part of it, like, it's very natural and normal that, like, let's say people are using different languages, like the new age language, that like, I feel this energy, I feel your energy, like some people, they call it woo woo, but I guess that tool has helped me to realize that, like, there are things that I can explain scientifically, but there's a lot of things that they're scientific, but we don't just have the tools to measure and explain it. So I can say that, like, I have written my best paper, which is probably the highest cited paper, based on basically an imagination, based on kind of like dreaming, and that was to me one of the signs that, like, you really have to allow yourself to come out of the this kind of like, maybe I would say, this structure of science, let's say, to be able to bring other things and then like use that language to at least to explain as much as you can, rather than just calling it non-scientific or pseudoscience, and then just like put it aside.
Yeah, nice one. All right. So I want to get the sequence when we move into the Halma and Zoroastrianism and so on. Presumably, the kid who was doing self-directed reading of the Quran and Hafiz and whatever was aware vaguely of, who the Zoroastrians were, who Zoroaster was, and consequently that there was this substance that the priests had access to. Like, so I'm trying to get in my head the sequence of, did you know about this and have a short list of what the candidate components of Halma may have been prior to ayahuasca or other psychedelics? Or was it more like, okay, cool, so I've just had this psychedelic experience. My own tradition has stories of psychedelia, of entheogens. And I wonder, like, talk us through the sequence of how you got to where you are now.
Exactly, that was the latter one. Like, that was, for me, it was basically getting into like I started just basically using these all like I would say like mind altering substances very late in my let's say late 30s, I would say. I was not like a, I don't know, teenager who took LSD, you know, when I was very young. So yeah, it came through exposure to ayahuasca, to psilocybin, and then I started to dig into. I realized that okay, this is something that probably any tradition has had, you know, and let me just look into see what I would find, you know, in the Iranian tradition. And then I started to look into some of the, like the work of different scholars, you know, that existed. And then there's a lot of knowledge that doesn't exist, you know, you don't have access to, and then look for those. And then you see that when there is a silence somewhere, you know that there is a reason for that, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah, that's true.
yeah, and then yeah, I guess that was very late. I started in 2000. This company that I started in 2019 is started around basically bringing my chemical engineering skills into building an extraction machine. So it started with basically just a knowledge of extraction, and then with extraction I started to work with different plants. I started with cannabis first, and then from cannabis, that was the kind of like the beginning of the psychedelic renaissance. And then I moved quickly into like working with psilocybin mushrooms, and then working with specifically with mushroom. I realized that there are like mushrooms. There you're working with small molecules that are called alkaloids that are very deep into the plant, and then from there you realize that okay, there are so many psychoactives around the world in different plants, and then I looked into basically just looking back into the tradition. And it's interesting that like in our literature, you know, there is a lot of referrals to, for example, we call like in Hafiz and Rumi, for example, in many areas, and many other mystics and poets, they're referring to this water of life. You know, let's say there are something that you drink, and you know, but what they call the Ab Hayat, or for example, you know, there are, you know, many other referrals like that, but they're all metaphorical. Like you always think that this is something that, you know, just like relating to your connection to the higher realm or the realm of divine. But those referrals, if you look back specifically, you see that many of them are actually has had a real referral to something. But maybe over time, because that's been obscured or somehow been deleted, then like has come to the, you know, to more of a metaphoric expression. This is kind of I think there has been, especially with Sufi tradition, because like the Islam, you know, the Shia is kind of a tweak of you know, Islam that came actually in Iran, like during Safavid time, right? And they also were exposed to, there were referrals, there's a lot of referrals, for example, for exposure to, you know, hashish or cannabis during that time. But that is very different. You don't, that's something that I have to still dig into to see like how was the let's say use case or where they were taking it. Let's say there are people in Pakistan still, like they're in Iran, you know, that they are doing these kind of gatherings that are, you know, like they are somehow exposed to some level of hashish or cannabis. But what we are talking about is very old. Like if you talk to even Zoroastrians, they don't know about this. This is before Zoroastrians. This is pre-Zoroastrians. So Magi were pre-Zoroastrian priests, you know, and then basically Moges, which we call it Moq. Moq in Farsi is basically the priest of Zoroastrian religion, or the priest of pre-Zoroastrian religion even. And Magi is actually the plural of Moges, which we call Moq, or Moges is basically a single word, and then Magi is basically, Magi were the priest who helped, or who actually followed Zarathustra's teachings and helped him to actually spread his teachings to more people.
Yeah.
This word actually has come in Gotha, which is the exact word of Zarathustra. Gotha is the kind of like the older version of Avesta, which is the holy book of Zoroastrians that are related directly to Zarathustra. And
Okay, this is like probably important because I watched it yesterday. I'll link up the presentation on the Vicenna YouTube channel that you gave about pre-Zoroastrianism and ancient Zoroastrianism and so on. But if we're after this substance, this is quite important, isn't it? So let's talk about the sequence, as you say. Like what is the cosmology of the Magi? Like, what's the time period we're looking? uh, because the substance emerges. They had a substance
they had
that
substance,
they
yeah.
would drink
I would
for
let's say like
insight. So tell
let's
us
look
that.
into before Iranians and Indians kind of like spread to different lands. So this is where the Indo-European come to kind of like the north of Iran. They come a little bit down. That's where they called Aryans, and then they or Indo-Iranians, and then in the Indo-Iranians, Homo Somo is still the same thing. So it's just the pronunciation is different. Like it's like Hindu Sindhu. They pronounce. I'm not sure how they pronounce it differently in Iran. That the this they just basically translated to basically the pronunciation changed to be as he, but that was the time that there were priests. They were cattle runners. They had this job of being a priest who were just like working with a small group of cattle runners. That was the communities. And then they started just to go down on these lands. Let's say part of them they went mostly toward India, northwest of India, and then the other part came to the northeast of Iran, where Khorasan, and then like north of Afghanistan, today's Afghanistan is. And that is where the Zarathustra is actually also from. And then the Sanskrit language, kind of like that's where the Sanskrit also gets separated from the old Avestan language. So these are the very two different type of people. And the Sanskrit and Soma has been there for, let's say, this is like about 2,500 years BC.
Yeah.
And then let's say between 2,500 years to about, let's say, 1,700, this is the time that there has been this shamanic practices that all the teachings, they were just oral. So they were just all the teachings, they were just this linguistic technology that they were using by chanting, and they were just transferring that to the next generation and next generation. So one of the distinctions between basically between Avesta or Gotha and Rig Veda is that Avesta or Gotha was transcribed about 1,000 years after. They were 1,000 years after Rig Veda, and that is why like some scholars that have worked specifically on Homo Soma, they believe that the referrals to the definition of Homo was more valid in
Okay.
let's say in the later referrals because they were more accurate and more recent. That is kind of making the old Avestan language, and then Gotha, and then Avesta basically. But when you look into Rig Veda, like the referral to Soma is there are so many things that are introduced as Homa. Homa is a god. Homa is a deity. Homa is also something that they drink, and they give them this this immortality, the sense of immortality, and but when you come to the Zoroastrian pantheon, Homa has a very different. The Homa is a potion. Homo is something that they drank. There's no referral to that as a deity in the
Yeah.
Zoroastrian pantheon, and so that is kind of where I would say these two were separated, and the timeline in terms of the time, like about
Yeah.
2,500 to about 17, to about 1,400 BC.
And what interests me about this, because I'm super interested in Eurasia 10,000 BC, for instance, is what we have at 2,500 BC is the first textual evidence that historians can use to say, okay, cool, we have evidence that they're talking about this here in the sense of we can backcast from the writing to basically guess that they're transmitting this information on a oral basis, but what was happening at 2501 BC. Like we actually, when it comes to a little bit earlier or even a lot older than that, why I think the difference between, say, Homer and Soma, when you look at the Rig Veda and you look at Zoroastrianism, is important is we can demonstrate, and this is a really problematic term, but go with me on this, we can demonstrate a complexification out of an initial shamanic cosmology where if you think about ayahuasca in its traditional context, she, and this is how I experience her anyway, like she is a her, she is a grandmother ayahuasca, so she's a collection of plant spirits and she's her own spirit, and you talk about her as a medicine and you talk about her as a being, and we have that, we can spy that older experience. This is my take, let me know what you think. In the Rig Veda we can spy that older experience of here is a substance that is also a collection of beings and so on. And then with 1,000 years of development or complexification, it has become something that fits in like a more complex worldview, where it is a substance used by priests to get updates from the spirit world. And it's not, these two things aren't counter. We can make the pretty good case, perhaps, that when you look at the different descriptions of them over 1,000 years, we can see even further back, but we can also see the journey of a collection of plant substances, let's say, that looks like the journey of collections of plant substances in other parts of the world, from a poly being that is both a medicine and a being and a god and a ancestor, to something that's like, here's a potion that's used by wizards to talk to the spirits. Is that like, what do you think to that?
Yeah, I think it's this deity side is nothing. I can't say that it's separate or is something that was built
Yeah.
or it's a mistake. Let's say it's a metaphorical mistake. It is specifically because I have tested all of these supplements to make this basically the formulation for Magi. Like I guess sometime probably that comes from, I would say, let's say if I naturally think about how we went through, let's say, this about 10,000 years. So I guess there were times that there were less people and then more nature, and then the connection with more nature and then a smaller group of people, and naturally, let's say the connection to the outside was bolder than the distraction that today we have with just like communication with humans, or let's say now it's just that today is the worst version, which is like media and social media, blah blah. But what I also believe, and I've sensed it, is that under these potions, or let's say this specifically, this I would like we get to that, but this dream inducing potion. So you tap into a layer of consciousness that is more collective, that is related to a residue of the fragment of the consciousness of our ancestors and people today, whatever it is that we can describe today. But that's a being, that's an understanding from a perspective of a human. That is something, that is, it's either like, let's say it's a smaller size of a god that, has its own, it's exactly like deity, that it has its own, let's say characteristic. And you see that exists in the Zoroastrian pantheon too, right? Like the Mithra, or let's say Ahura Mazda, or like there's like, and the same in Rig Veda. So they knew these beings, and kind of like there's this non-tangible beings or entities that they were bigger than human. Their consciousness are in a different scale, and they had this tools to access to them or to call them. And it may, even today, for example, like we are working with this plant that Iranians, almost all Iranians, they have it in their home. It's called a spand or Syrian rue, and we burn it because we believe that we are reverting the evil's eye. And to so many, it's superstition, but everybody is doing that. But the real thing is that Zoroastrians also, they were also, their Derusha is basically another name that they were using for Homa, which is not drinking it, but burning it. And that's exactly for letting these entities to go away, the entities that are not invited. So,
Yeah.
like being a
This is yeah.
scientist talking about this is, I would say, unless I really like believe in this step by step, conclusion to that, I would never have talked today as what I'm referring to, this unknowns.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, around here, I'm just going to say things like spirits because I get to.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't have to play scientist to do that. But I think this is what you mentioned, the use of incense. This is super important because I'm sure, like you said, well, technically for longer because I've been dabbling in this field historically for a couple of decades now, and there have been candidates for Soma since the whole Road to Eleusis thesis came out, which is that broadly speaking, cultures develop on top of psychedelic experiences. So that places like Eleusis had an actual substance that would alter people's consciousness, etc., etc. And the one people have been looking for a while has been Soma. And there's historical reasons for that, the British Empire's fascination with its colonies and so on, right? And the top of the list has never been very satisfactory. So the top of the list for the last 40 years, the Syrian Rue's been there, but there's been challenges with its description, which we'll get to in a second, which I think you've frankly solved, which is how it potentiates. So Syrian Rue has been on the short list, but the one that people in this world mostly think about is Amanita muscaria, which it just isn't. And one of the reasons it isn't is you don't use mushrooms as incense. Like this is, Soma is used, well, actually, let me know what you think about that. But also, what did the Magi use Homa for? Like, because I think this will help people realize what it is, what the journey that you are on, and an amazing discovery that you guys have made.
absolutely. First of all, I think we have to put a distinction between Homa Soma. I think this
Sure.
is, and the reason for that is, first of all, like all these 100, 200 years of speculation about Homa Soma, or what plant was Homa. Like the Homa was not a plant. Like Homa was a potion. Homa was an extract. Homa was something that Homa did, even the word means to press out, like you're pressing something out of a plant or a group of plant. And so whatever it was, the Magi had the formulation, or like some people had the formulation. They knew, let's say, how much of let's say the plant has to get into the this pestle and mortar to be pressed out and then washed out and then come out as a potion. This is one thing. The other thing is that the reason that they were using Homa Soma, it has different contexts. I'm not an expert in Soma. I'm mostly looking into the Zoroastrian context, and with the Zoroastrian context, they were taking within the basically within the assembly of priests. So it was never for regular people. It was always for elites. In Iran at that point it had castes of basically priests, castes of warriors and kings, and then castes of farmers. Even they had their own different fire temple in Iran. There are 3 different fire temples in Iran that basically people of those castes, they were going to their own fire temple, and so Homa stayed within the Magi, or within the priests, and then it was exposed also to others, outside those. For example, there is this story of Zarathustra who actually brought Homa to Rishtas, which was the king of his time, and then he drank it. It is one of the stories that exists, and is documented. And then he had this 3 days out of body, and then when he wakes up, he follows, the teachings, and he supports it as a supporter. And then there is another book which is called the Book of Ardai Viraz, which is actually it's an 8,000 words book that exists on Google. This is kind of like an apocalyptic story about this guy who was not a priest, who was just a righteous man, who was a person that was trusted by the community, who was brought into the fire temple of Farbag in close to Fars, which there is nothing left of that. But he was invited by the Magi, by the priest, to basically in representation of the people to go to travel to the other realms, to the realm of after death, to make sure that their teachings or their prayers, their theology, practices was right, and it's basically to the right gods, kind of like confirmation of their practice. So there are different referrals for why it was the reason. But another reason is about a practice or a ritual which is called the yasna ritual. So yasna ritual is where they make homa, and then traditionally today, when, for example, they're not practicing it in Iran anymore. I guess I've heard that the last time was 1962. It's like a very long process. But they're still doing it in India within the Parsi community. But at the end, what they drink is a very different, it's a very mild potion that comes out of ephedra, basically, which is kind of like a very mild, like a microdose of MDMA, I would say. That's the effect. But those effects, but those assembly was kind of like there were only priests. There were two priests that one of them was making a batch from the day before, and then the new priest was coming to the next day. So the new priest was being tested by the other priest when the new priest was going through this journey of afterlife, and then kind of like the truth of that person was coming up through this exposure to homa. So homa, basically, if you're a righteous person, homa keeps you and you're not going to have any problem. You go through the experience, you come back, no problem. But if you are, pretending, or if you are, let's say, if you're not by heart that, like you're not there to serve, that's kind of like where there it becomes like more like a, I would say, just a test, just a test of the other priests. So there was an assembly of the 6 priests that the new priest, who was called Raspi. There was Zotar and Raspi. Raspi was basically taking homa in presence of this assembly while they were present. I don't think any of these are happening today, but if whoever is interested in listening to this podcast, if they look into the Yasna number 9, 10, and 11 of Avesta, the whole thing is about Homa. So it just tells about like how Homa came to basically 3 generations before Zarathustra, and then Zarathustra's mom and dad, and then it goes all the way, and it describes about Homa. And it's kind of like the main part of Avesta. But there's also one caveat here to mention, Gordon, and that is that Zoroastrians, they believe that, and this is also coming from some of the linguists of the Gothic linguists, that Zarathustra at some point actually, it seems that this shamanic and ecstatic practices was a big part of Indo-Iranians before that, and some of those they were being taken by warriors. For example, warriors that were taking this, again, another potion. Was it Homa, or was it a different formulation of Homa for fury, for just like becoming more brave, when they were going for battles? And so at some point, basically, Zarathustra comes and, like ask for people. Basically, he revokes the whole thing. He asked people not to overuse Homa. And that is how Zoroastrians actually kind of like separate their whole religion, because they believe that Zarathustra actually asked them to not use Homa, and Homa basically just like as like some that's related basically to priest Zarathustra. So that's also a very very current narrative of Zoroastrians and Homa.
Yeah, well. Sacraments tend to depotentize over time. I mean, if you look at the communion, if you look at Christian Mass, right? Like, whatever idea that began in weird catacombs in Rome in the first few centuries AD, it's certainly not that today. So what I love about the textual documents is you have this beam of light onto a period of time that indicates a very sophisticated pharmacology, because, as you say, it was used by warriors and so on. And within that beam of light, it shows it shows more than that, but it illuminates the likely combination candidate for Homa. But because it does that, it implies that far more complex pharmacology, and consequent like that shamanic survival pharmacology into Iranianism, right? But I think I want to get to the effects, and because this is the other part of the Magi thesis or project that I think you've absolutely nailed. But just to remind people, the word Homa means extraction. That's so important. It's not the name of a plant, so you can't, or a mushroom. Like it literally means process, like a kind of process, right? It means extraction. So you are talking about the sacred substance is a process rather than a thing, which is when you begin to, which invites you to go, okay, cool. Well, we're talking about harmalines from an effect perspective because of dreams and so on, but because it's a process, it's like, well, what else is available and what things can combine with that to make something that describes what we understand from the time. And you mentioned ephedra, and the other one that's worth looking at is a form of henbane, right? So when we talk about Homa, we need to understand that it's a recipe rather than a plant. And consequently, and this is the key, I think, to where you guys have cracked it, is, well, instead of picking like this, the Eleusis question, right? It's like, oh, was it an ergot derivative or was it this? It's like people are looking for one substance, but the word itself is literally a process.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
when you get that, it opens up and say, okay, well, let's look at what they had available to them and see what we can do from an effects match to the descriptions. And that's where you guys landed. So talk us through that.
Yeah, I think the whole unlocking part, Gordon, happened through the fact that the effect of these compounds, or I would say maybe the physiological experience around those moments of epiphanies and revelations has been described. So that is kind of like how we went through a screening of different, let's say, different pharmacology. But this is one point. The other point is that I've learned that because there are, for example, when they're talking about priests, about warriors, and that's this like basically taking it for, let's say, for furious, being more furious, or just bravery. Is that the same thing, or let's say, are some of these subjective experiences that has been described, or do they match, for example, the effect of ephedra or ephedrine at all? They do not. Like, if you just go through the text, and that's actually comes from the proper linguistic research that I'm actually indebted to the work of Martin Schwartz, who is actually a scholar in this field, and then basically another scholar, an American scholar, basically David Flattery, who there's a book, Homa and Harmaline, that they have gone through most of these texts and they have tried to bring out these definitions of a state of minds or the subjective experiences. It's not only a state of mind and subjective experiences, it's also physiological symptoms. For example, vomiting, diarrhea, or let's say this dreamy state. For example, the revelation of Zarathustra came in a dreamy state. He wakes up, he's still in this dreamy state. So if Homa is ephedra is basically reverting sleep. You can't fall asleep. It's like when you take MDMA, you can't fall asleep. It's an amphetamine, so it can't be Homa. So Homa, and then the other thing is that, for example, in another, when Zarathustra takes Homa takes this potion to Wishtas, it's not called Homa anymore. It's called Mang. So it's another name, it's another name of another potion. So you see that these priests, they had different formulation. They were adding different additives. Exactly, they were adding, for example, Henbane Mang some people, they think that it's coming from bang, which is related to the Sanskrit word for cannabis. But mang before 12th century in Iran is actually referring to black henbane, which is an atropine alkaloid group, and then they are kind of like more like on a delirium. They're delirious. So they were mixing henbane with Homa. And then what was Homa then? It's just like basically Mang is henbane and Homa. And then you see that they had different formulation that they were just concocting on different events. So when you put everything together, then you're able, and then when you understand the physiology and neuroscience and also psychology, I guess this is kind of like they're a very multidisciplinary thing. You have to understand on a receptor level, you have to understand the psychological, the subjective state, and you have to understand the pharmacology, and then the story. So these four together kind of like it solves the problem. That's how actually we kind of like ended up realizing that we believe that beta carbolines that are coming from Syrian rue, that are like harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, harmol, harmolol, harmon, like these group of compounds, most of them, they are dream inducing. So there was a component in HOMO which was dream inducing. And so does that mean that Syrian rue was part of it? So that is how actually we went more and more toward. I started basically extracting, Syrian rue and then isolating into different compounds, and then that was how our drug discovery journey. We embarked on this drug discovery journey just to define this matrix of different compounds and different doses, and then we tested through an experimental design. We tested through all of those, and then we realized that yes, that is how we get more toward that state of mind.
Yeah. I want to talk about the drug discovery pivot to nootropic because he's retired now, but my father's a psychiatrist, and he did his training at a time where basically it was single molecules or bust, like singular molecular effect or nothing. Right? And we've been arguing politely, but we've been arguing for 2 decades that that world is over. But it's over for us in the sense of we understand that from a generation of new medicine perspective, we need to allow for more than one effect or more than one molecule to be part of a medicine. However, the approval structure around in the West is still very much, because we would talk about the early use of MDMA in psychiatry in the early to mid 20th century and so on. And he said that it alleviates, same thing with psilocybin, it will instantly alleviate symptoms of depression. But he says, but the trouble is it also gets you high. Yeah. And so that's that additional effect that allopathic medicine has been seeking on a policy basis to avoid for 70 years, right? Yeah. And so you guys discovered this amazing sacred substance, and you're very familiar with this journey from, okay, well, let's see if this is a medicine. And whilst I believe it is, it can't fit into what is legally required to be a medicine at the moment. Is that a fair description of the journey into Magi as nootropics?
First of all, I'm really fascinated with all your knowledge about drug discovery and all these issues. It's fascinating. So I want to just this is very interesting because when the Vicenna is actually coming from the legacy of Avicenna. So an Avicenna is this. You look into so if you look into basically just the whole work that Avicenna has done, in the past there was always a mixture. There was always, even in Iranian traditional, let's say when I was a kid, they were just taking that, okay, this is warm, this makes you, let's say, cold, you have to take this with the other one. So there was always something that was balancing for the side effect, so when we moved from, in 2020, we had all these compounds, we called them API, and then which is 99.5% pure compound, single molecule, as you said. And then we started to recombine them, and then let's say in a way that we were mixing 2 or 3 compounds. And then in 2021 and early 2022, we did a lot of clinical studies around the chemistry and the pharmacology, and then pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetics, how it works in the body. But exactly, we got to this point that there were 2 caveats. One was that none of the investors were interested to invest in something that you can protect. So they liked a small molecule that you go into your lab and then you build a new molecule and then you patent that. And the second thing, as you said, FDA doesn't like any mixing. FDA likes a single molecule to make the problem simple. And then you make this molecule and then these side effects, and then you just have to find, how much is the efficacy, if it's everything is safe, and then what are the side effects. But the real drugs, this is the Eastern versus the Western medicine. The real drugs always sits into the mixtures. And so at that point, this is kind of like summer last year, we thought that, okay, do we want to really spend another 10 years trying to convince and raise another 500 million to just take another molecule, which probably another 50 other companies trying to do that. And our chance of success was very low. So me and my co-founder, we actually had this journey within, and after months we came out and we decided that, okay, so we really want to help people today. And what we decided was we went through like the compounds that they were not scheduled in the US, and they're non-scheduled. Basically they're not scheduled 3 or schedule 1. So beta carbolines, they were not scheduled. So that was where we came out of a drug discovery. We are still Vicenna is a drug discovery company. We're still testing a lot of things, but instead of pushing it for an IND and then go to phase 1 trial, which we probably look into that even in future. For example, if we still have a few formulation that we think that they're going to help people in a different way, but for us to be able to get what we have quickly to market, that was the time that we launched Magi. So Magi is a direct to consumer line of natural supplement based on the legacy of Homa. So they are psychoactive, but they are not psychedelics, and they are fully legal. So our products are being sold in the market today in the US, and hopefully will be available globally soon. But they are in some countries, like some of the compounds, they're still a schedule 3, they may be a schedule 1. So we are cognizant of those, but in the US there's no problem. So that is how actually we landed on launching Magi, and then basically coming up with these formulation, which again, even the philosophy around the formulation is a topic that I can extend further.
No, wonderful. So let's talk about START specifically. I'm really interested in. So on this show, we have a lot of listeners who are extremely competent in. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but astrology has had a serious renaissance in the last 20 years. And that's discovery and translation of Arab astrological texts, and an awareness of, in the world of magic, the Magi and Zoroastrianism is both literally and metaphorically the ancestors of a whole bunch of stuff, like getting astrology right, like sacred timing and all the rest of it. And I'm very interested in the idea of listeners to this show who have a competence in that kind of really classic traditional astrology, experimenting and exploring with substances like START, because it is that that opening up, that benefit or support to a process of meditation and inner intuitive inspiration. And it just seems like, I have no evidence for this yet, but it just seems to me like a return together rather than an experiment, because in a very meaningful sense, these two things once belonged together. And I really like the idea of having, I know the astrologers who listen to this show who are very good at it, have a daily meditational practice, are interested in self-development in that sense outside of astrology, and use astrology to describe it. So I'm really excited to see what people who listen to a show like this can do with a substance that is ultimately part of that same sort of lineage. So talk to us about how people can, how START can help. What are its effects? How long does it last? Can I take 5 of them and drive a tractor? What happens?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I would go with maybe a little bit of a mechanistic explanation of what is happening under these compounds. So, and what is this dreamy state, and what happens under the dreamy state. So when we try to fall asleep, or for example, when you sit in meditation for a long time, there is this kind of boundary that you sometimes may pass, and kind of you fall asleep, but you're still awake. So there is this stage, especially, let's say, if your listener want to practice it, when you want to, let's say, lie down to fall asleep, just keep reminding yourself that you're still awake, you're still awake, you're still awake. And then there's a point that you're not conscious anymore. But there might be, sometimes you pass, and this happens in physics, exactly this, the supercritical stage is the same stage. Supercritical stage is when you pass a phase, but you're still in the previous phase. Basically, you get to from, let's say, liquid to gas, but you're still liquid, but you're beyond that point. So this is that point. So what is that point? That point is you're still conscious when you're open to unconscious. So that is the dream state. And then when we fall asleep, there's no track. There's just this whole REM sleep stars, and then our basically, if you look into our brain waves, the moment that you fall asleep, our brain waves start to go crazy. It's people, they think that their brain sleeps, but their brain is basically just like more active than being, awake and active. So that is the REM sleep. That's where we're still processing. We are still there. We are there. We are free of space and time, but we just don't remember because that's how our physiology is managing this. But if you learn and if you practice to be present, and then basically just get to that supercritical region and then start to remember what is happening and start to practice what is happening. So that is where, that in that dreamy state, basically you get exposed to the realm of unconscious. We are conscious. There are things that in our brain, it's kind of gets, again, a fragment goes, into our memory, becomes the subconscious, becomes our shadow. But there is this whole thing that we have no information about. And in our sleep, when we fall asleep, we are free from, those limitations. So this is the practice. This is what happens. And then let's say with meditation, we try to get our brain to consciously slow down, and then basically just for our intuition and for the flow of information to come toward us without we going, after them. So when you do, basically that is a practice of meditation. That's a practice of like open awareness meditation. If you're not, let's say, you are trying to just slow down your monkey brain and just be present right now, right here, do nothing. And that's why it's also very difficult for some people to get into the practice of meditation. And it's always, there's judgment because our brain wants to go, after another thought. But that is where, when you get into phenomenology, that the dreamy state is the door to where the reductions happen. And what are the reductions? Reductions are where we are cross-passing consciousness planes. So that's where you get to, let's say, receive awareness in a very big chunk. That's exactly like the revelation of Zarathustra. He received this omniscient wisdom immediately. He just knows about this. Or for example, if you look into it, becoming a little bit more on the contemporary side, if you look into Claudio Naranjo's book and the experiments that he did on around 60s with the harmaline, the injection of harmaline, there is a book called The Book of Healing. I guess I'm not sure if I'm bringing the name of the book right, but there is a chapter in that book that is about harmaline and collective unconscious. So the book is basically, that chapter goes through the journey of 3 of the patients that are being injected 1 dose of harmaline, and then he goes, basically it's interesting, like 5 minutes after the injection, they have this huge epiphanies. Like they just know that, for example, they were not that character that they wanted to be the whole life. So that awareness, that again, that big chunk that comes toward you, that is where we are after with this start. So I would say a start is kind of like a mini dose to that understanding of that realization. And then we're actually like launching a macro dose in next week. There is this biggest psychedelic conference happening in Denver by MAPS, that our macro dose is actually a Revelation 8.
I love it.
But then they have to just approach it very thoughtfully and very intentionally. They have to just lie down, be present. They get like the body, unlike, for example, psilocybin or DMT or ayahuasca. Like ayahuasca is a little bit the same, but maybe I just add something to that later. But the body gets a little bit numb, and then kind of you feel a little bit sick, it's not like you're active, you can actively think. That is when then you open to receive information, and then you can just be that witness, that point of witnessing, and then just processing somehow. So that is kind of like, that is how we brought these formulation around the mindfulness, because that's the language of processing mysticism today, or at least the secular mysticism, if nothing related to divine, let's say.
Cool. So for people who, so basically, I would take it an hour before I wanted to do a meditation session, rather than take it in the morning with my NAC and vitamins and so on, right? Particularly the higher dose that's launching next
Yeah.
week.
The meditation
It's
start. Sorry, at the start we just like we ask for people, basically our consumer, to take it 15 minutes before sitting into meditation, and the effect takes like kind of it takes about 15 minutes for you to feel it. The feeling is very mild, and it may last between, let's say, 45 minutes to about 90 minutes, and that is kind of like the optimum time for example, somebody who wants to meditate deeper. With the macro dose, somebody was tested that was telling me that like that was like getting into the seventh day of a vipassana practice. So for somebody
okay.
who has like, these are kind of like a little bit of a scaling, let's say, with other practices, but that's a little bit more intense in terms of the experience. But the start, which is our meditation supplement, is very mild, and it helps you to just like go a little bit deeper. The word start, the meaning of the start is a Pahlavi word, and it has, again, it's a definition of a state of mind, which is it allows your mind to sprawl out to broader consciousness. That's exactly what happens, and that's why we brought that name to be put on this supplement.
Yeah, fantastic. So I've been looking at it. Obviously, Syrian rue is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So, not that we can give medical or any other kind of advice in this kind of context, but for people who are experimenting with microdosing, whether it's like LSD and psilocybin and so on, this will have some kind of effect in combination with that, and it's something to for people to be aware of, like beneficial effect, but in the sense of this is outside of what is written on the back of the bottle,
Yeah.
and and if you are going in that direction, you are on your own. But be aware that it is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, or contains,
Yeah.
and so it will interact with other psychedelics that people may be taking.
Yeah, and the psychedelics, and also other antidepressants, and anti-anxiety. And so I want to add something else, again, for your listeners, that I recommend everyone not to try to use Syrian rue seeds, because Syrian rue seeds, like let's say in a lower, let's say dose, it might not be toxic, but it has other alkaloids that are toxic. Let's say there are reports of having tremors, like heavy tremors for people who have tried that, and then yeah, just there are all kinds of. There's a lot of basically studies in the pharmacological text about this. So what we do is we are purifying, we're extracting and purifying, and then we're recombining, these compounds in a very certain dose, based on the study that we have done, based on all those physiological and neurophysiological biomarkers. So this was one point to share. The other point is that, so like everybody knows like beta carbolines as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and scientifically, it's kind of like they say that they potentiate your tryptamine experience, or whatever that is, a serotonin potentiator, basically serotonin receptor potentiator, because it allows for the serotonin to stay for a longer term between your synaptic cleft. But we believe that is just the tip of the iceberg about beta carbolines. That's not
Yes.
what makes the effect. The dreamy state comes from another receptor. It's not necessarily due to basically what they do as an inhibitor to your 5-HT receptors. And yeah, I can't just like go on a rant on that, but if I'm not sure if you're in
No, I get
your
it.
audience are interested, but um, yeah, kind of like my understanding, especially from even from ayahuasca, like ayahuasca, the original ayahuasca didn't have the DMT. The original ayahuasca didn't have the chacruna leaves. It was the bark of the Banisteriopsis copy, which is again only the beta carbolines. So, and just recently, last week, there was another paper coming out from the analysis, the mass spectrometry analysis of a potion that came from ancient Egypt. I'm not sure if you have seen that paper. In that cup, again, they found the remainders of Syrian rue, of a span, which, as you see, I guess I'm actually realizing that I was in Amazon about like a months ago, and I really just went to just make ayahuasca with Santa Daime Church and like kind of just breaking, these the bark and then just hammering the bark, and you realize that all these kind of mystical traditions, they were kind of somehow related with some level of this dreamy state. That the dreamy state is what makes a DMT experience like different from an ayahuasca experience. It's not only potentiating their chacruna leaves DMT. It's an onerophrenic state. It's this dreamy state that's being potentiated with the DMT experience. So it was not like
Yeah.
these shamans, they found this plant and this plant by chance and randomly, and then they worked synergistically. It was the bark in the jungle that they were taking it, and then they started adding other additives, which one of them was DMT, one of them was chacruna leaves. And if you go to Shipibo or other tribes, they're adding all kinds of different additives to that. So I think like what we are doing also is a kind of little bit opening our research toward the kind of underestimating beta carbolene only as MAOIs, but again, and scientifically, it's again MAOIs they should not be taken with tyramines, so they have to be some type of diets when you're taking it. That's why you can take some dieta for ayahuasca, and other similar practices.
I've had vine only in Ecuador, and I can tell you it's more than a potentiator for DMT. Like you're absolutely right about that. And funnily enough, what I said earlier, and I appreciate where you guys are from a business perspective and talking about molecules, and I'm grateful that work continues. But when we get to moments like this where we have to understand that the beta harmalines are more than potentiators, I look at it as we have reached the end of what a molecular understanding can do ontologically. So we can, and we're sort of stuck in this world where it's like, okay, well, hang on. Actually, Syrian rue as a plant does these things, and Kapi as a vine does these things. And for me, obviously, this is a show about magic and astrology and so on. It invites me to sit more in the plant spirit, like the being that is Syrian rue and the being that is the ayahuasca vine is more than one molecule that does one thing that we've observed, right? It's like it's a much bigger
Yeah,
experience between the two of them.
absolutely.
No, I am very excited for this project. I can understand why Dr. Mark Plotkin made this connection, because you have done something remarkable. Honestly, this is,
Thank you so
and
much.
it's just the beginning of that journey. You've definitely since making the connection, I've been sitting with the implications of this. I have a question about, presumably you use one of these products, let's just say Starred, on an almost daily basis. Like, do you use it with your daily meditations? Have you noticed any long-term effects now that you might be 6 months into, excluding dietas, but
Yeah.
6 months into, or so, even a year longer into a regular practice? Have you noticed any long-term effects of them?
You mean negative long term or in general, like
No, positive ones, like
Yeah.
I can actually get more of that inspiration if I sit down and
Yeah.
meditate without it. Like, is people, we're only now in that world where people have been microdosing, say, psilocybin for 3+ years, and they're noticing long-term changes in thinking, improved dream recall, that kind of stuff. Have you noticed for yourself using the product that
Yeah.
there have been changes like that?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I guess the answer to that comes from, again, my observation, and this is a very recent travel that I went to Brazil, to Santo Daime, and then we kind of spent this 2 weeks going to, let's say, different tribes. Specifically they were Santo Daime, but like not close to Mapia, and they were all like, these are again very young people, and also the elders, but they were all very welcoming and happy and like living in abundance and very intuitive. Like they were all smoking Santa Maria, which is weed, beside taking ayahuasca every other week. And for those who are familiar with Santo Daime is one of the for me was, I went for ayahuasca, but I actually came out to see that there was this religion being built on a very interesting practice. And the interesting practice is kind of like, there's some, basically the whole arrangement puts you in a state that the experience is not an individual experience anymore. It's a collective experience. So basically you get into a movement exactly like whirling, but instead of, let's say, turning, you get to this just like, basically there's just moving 2 steps to the right, 2 steps to the left, and then for 6 hours when you are on ayahuasca, which most of the people I would think, like, always thought that like we feel sick on ayahuasca and just throwing up, and I was never able to dance, if you call it that. It's not a dance, it's a meditation. But I guess my observation of them as people who are so giving, so open, happy, living in abundance, was that, so whatever they have made these indigenous people to, just to read this Portuguese hymn, which is nothing to do with their faces and with the color of their skin, is that happiness, is that that grace that comes from that practice, is that something within them is flowing them to show up in every ceremony, every other week. There is this physiological and psychological implication that brings them back. It's not like other religion that you have to push you to go to a church or a mosque. They all come. And it's not like they're really on an ayahuasca journey. They are part of this machine that is moving and moving for 6 hours. And for me, the first time it was very challenging. The second time I got, okay, this is it. This is not about my personal experience. I have to be part of this collective. Whatever the implication from a consciousness, a bigger consciousness level it is something to still process. But I would say, if you take these for a longer term, beside their neuroprotective and neurogenesis, which is the effect of beta carbolines, these are neurophysiological. But what is neuropsychological is actually becoming more, intuitive. So you allow to learn to control your mind, to be able to connect with everything that is outside and to receive from outside. Intuition is exactly receiving. In Farsi we call it shuhud. It means that like you see something. You don't need to read or learn or gain. You see it. You see through it. And that is what I think that is the effect of this dreamy state, that it helps you to get to kind of like a little bit of a higher of yourself in perception from outside. And it's not sensitive. It's not like your senses, like tryptamines, your senses also are kind of being stimulated. It's not very sensitive. There's some senses, like for example your smelling sense is getting more, you feel things more, but I would say the intuition and the sense of receiving from unknown is what is being potentiated. And and if anybody specifically, like with the whole hero's journey and this modeling of the journey that we go, that we want to, let's say, if we want to live a full life, we have to get out of this realm of known to the realm of unknown. This is a practice of living with the unknown. This is a practice of knowing that on an intentional basis you can surrender yourself, and then you can just receive and witness. And that is a very That's a very beautiful practice that allows us to fool our wholeness rather than our active self.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic final answer there, Shauheen. I think that's brilliant. For people who want to know more, and I am highly confident a lot of people would like to know more, they'll be yelling at their car radio or wherever they're listening to this now, say, what's the URL? Where can I find out more about Shauheen? Where can I find out more about Magi products? What you got coming up? That kind of thing. Lay it on us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking this question. So they can find me like on LinkedIn if they search my name, but the product, if they want to learn about it, the product brand is called Magi, Magi. The URL is ancestralmagi.com, ancestralmagi.com. And so the product are not still available outside US. Like we're trying to get it to Europe, maybe in fall, like around fall, and elsewhere. But we like this step by step. We just have to make sure that like we kind of like follow the regulatory in every jurisdiction. And currently it's available in the US. If you're anywhere in the US and US islands, like we ship to your address, and you can have those. For outside US, please just follow us on Instagram. It's @Ancestral_Magi. @Ancestral_Magi. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and you get more information as soon as they're available. We would be happy to share those with a larger audience. And another thing that we want to really add to that, specifically with my own journey around the community part of this sense of living, or this intuitive, living more intuitively, is actually that again, building community around these practices, which that's where the rituals come. That we would love to get to that stage as well, to have more intentional collective experiences that are kind of like a very mini dose. But again, those are coming a little bit later, and if they are staying connected to us, they're going to learn more about what we are doing.
Fantastic. Well, again, really, really amazing discussion, amazing journey you're on.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for this fantastic conversation. And people listening to this, or indeed watching it, Shauheen gave a fantastic presentation on YouTube, which I watched yesterday in preparation for this call. And it's to do with pre-Zoroastrian Iran, and more detail around the journey of ancient Homer and so on. And it's really, really good supplementary material for our discussion. So you will find that in the show notes. But Shauheen, thank you so much. Well done. And I'm really excited to see where the Magi journey goes.
Thank you, Gordon. Thanks so much for all the great work and the great content, like unique content that you're making. It's just like very rare, and I really love just browsing through your website, just looking into your books, and just like learning from you is also a pleasure for me. Let's stay in touch, and thanks for having me on your podcast.